picture this, 1469, a child is born, and it's kind of hush-hush a scandal, really, because this child is born outside of marriage in a world where the church's word was law, and this child, Desiderius Erasmus, would grow up to, like, rock the boat of European thought. I mean, it really shake things up. So today we are doing a deep dive into the life of this remarkable man.
And it is a remarkable story. We're going to be tracing those key moments in Erasmus's life and those powerful ideas that he had. We are working with a pretty in-depth biographical account here, and I think our goal today is to help you really understand Erasmus's significance. What were those challenges he faced? What were his achievements, his lasting impact? I think along the way we might find a few surprises or a few things that make you go, huh?
Yeah, I'm looking forward to those. So let's jump right in. I mean, let's start with the beginning. It was a difficult one. Erasmus was born in 1469, and his birth was considered illegitimate. His father was a priest, his mother a physician's daughter, and that wasn't just some personal detail. It really defined his early life.
Right.
How do you think that social reality shaped his outlook, in the beginning and even maybe later on, his ambitions?
You have to remember just how much illegitimacy mattered back then. I mean, this wasn't just a little bit awkward socially. It could really limit your opportunities in life. People were always watching you, judging you. And for Erasmus, that probably made him feel like an outsider from the very beginning.
Yeah.
And maybe that's part of what pushed him to prove himself through his intellect. It could have been a driving force behind everything he accomplished.
Yeah.
It gave him a unique perspective, too. Being on the outside looking in, he could critique the very society that had rejected him.
That's a really interesting point, that being an outsider could actually make you more insightful. And, speaking of experiences that shape you, especially, I mean, I hate to say it, kind of horrific ones, when Erasmus was just 8 years old, he saw something truly awful. Over 200 war prisoners were being tortured on the rack. It was ordered by a local bishop. Imagine that for a moment. What kind of lasting impact would that kind of brutality have, especially coming from a religious authority? Do you think that planted some early seeds of change in him?
I think we have to think about how trauma like that could completely change how a child sees the world. Witnessing that level of cruelty, and then on top of it, it's being done in the name of the church that could make anyone question everything, authority, justice, even what it means to be human.
Yeah.
It's very possible that this experience played a role in his later challenges to power structures and his belief that we need a more humane, a more rational approach to faith and to society as a whole.
Yeah, it's a disturbing thought, for sure. So let's move on to his education. He spent some time at a school run by the Brothers of the Common Life. And it's interesting because it seems like kind of a mixed bag. On one hand, he's introduced to all these classical texts, which obviously had a huge influence on him. But on the other hand, our source talks about these really harsh disciplinary methods. They were intended to, break a boy's spirit. How do you think he reconciled those two things? A bright, curious mind, like his stuck in this rigid system. What kind of internal conflict could that have created?
Well, it really highlights this clash that was happening at the time between this emerging humanist thought, which emphasized classical learning and individual inquiry, and then the more traditional, often very strict religious education. Yeah. So while those classical texts were definitely important for Erasmus's development, you have to wonder if that restrictive environment made him crave intellectual freedom even more. It could have even made him resentful of any system that tried to stifle independent thought. And in a way, maybe that fueled the very spirit of questioning that would become so central to his work.
It's almost like that environment was trying to hold him back, but it actually pushed him forward. So then we come to a period of really intense loss. I mean, as a teenager, he loses both his parents to the plague. And because he's left destitute, he's basically forced to enter a monastery. Can you imagine what that must have felt like, this life chosen for him, not by him, this feeling of being trapped, especially for someone with such a lively mind?
Losing his parents at that age and then being sent to a monastery, that had to be a very difficult time for him. For someone like Erasmus, who was so bright and so curious, the monastic life with all its rules and rituals, it could have felt like his potential was being wasted. His intellectual aspirations were being stifled. And think about it. He had no real control over his own life. And that must have been so hard for someone who wanted to explore and engage with the world of ideas.
Yeah, it does. But even within those walls, something incredible happened. That monastery library became his sanctuary. He dove headfirst into the writings of thinkers like Cicero. It's almost like his intellect found a way to break free even in that confined space. How important do you think this period of self-discovery was in shaping his future? I mean, our source even says that it was there that his dreams of freedom and enlightenment took root.
I think it's a perfect example of how even in the most limiting circumstances you can find opportunity. That monastic life wasn't what he would have chosen, but that library gave him the intellectual fuel he needed to do all the amazing things he would go on to do. that deep dive into classical thought, it laid the foundation for his humanist worldview, for his elegant writing style, even for his critiques of the religious and social norms of his time.
Mm.
It was in those quiet hours in that library that the seeds of his intellectual revolution were planted.
It's a really powerful image, this young man, finding freedom in the most unlikely of places. And then after 7 years, he leaves. Our source talks about the exhilaration of those first steps into the wider world, but also the uncertainty. What do you think that transition was like for him, going from this structured monastic life to the unknown?
That feeling of liberation had to be immense.
Yeah.
Finally free from years of routine. But I'm sure there was also a lot of anxiety. He was starting over with no safety net. He had his intellect, his growing reputation as a scholar. But making his way in the world, finding patrons, establishing himself, all of that would have been incredibly challenging.
Yeah.
His willingness to embrace that uncertainty says so much about his courage, his belief in himself and in his ideas.
It really does. And that courage paid off. He built this impressive reputation for his Latin skills, his sharp wit, his never-ending curiosity. He was moving in the circles of Europe's leading intellectuals. He became a true citizen of the world, as our source puts it. How important do you think those connections were in spreading his ideas and expanding his influence?
Oh, those connections were essential. It was during this time that he really built his intellectual network. He was meeting with thinkers from all over Europe, debating with them, sharing his ideas with them. And that network, it became the channel through which his writings would reach a wider audience. It was the engine behind his later impact. He wasn't working in isolation. He was part of this vibrant, interconnected community of intellectuals.
It makes you realize how important community is, right? And it was through his writing that he truly made his mark. His work, especially The Praise of Folly, has been described as throwing literary hand grenades at long-held beliefs, challenging the church's corruption head-on. What was it about that particular work that made it resonate so strongly and have such a lasting impact?
Well, The Praise of Folly is so brilliant because of the way Erasmus uses satire and wit to deliver these really serious criticisms. By personifying folly, he could point out all the absurdities, the hypocrisies, the moral failings of his time. And he did it in a way that was entertaining and thought-provoking at the same time. That approach allowed him to reach a much broader audience and to ask these really dangerous questions in a way that wasn't too confrontational, but was still incredibly effective in challenging the status quo.
It's a reminder that humor can be a powerful tool for change, right? So let's talk about his vision for education. Erasmus was a firm believer in the transformative power of knowledge. And he had this radical idea that everyone should have access to the Bible in their own language. Can you imagine how audacious that was back then when the church had such a tight grip on the scriptures? What kind of shift in power was he advocating for?
It really boils down to who controls knowledge and who gets to access it. Erasmus pushing for the Bible to be translated into everyday languages, that was a direct challenge to the church's authority. They were the only ones who were supposed to interpret the scriptures. By giving people the ability to read and understand the Bible for themselves, Erasmus wanted them to form their own opinions, to think critically, and maybe even to question the church's teachings. It was a radical concept. It could have completely changed the religious and intellectual landscape because it was essentially democratizing access to these sacred texts.
It was truly groundbreaking, and his own translation of the New Testament into Greek was a huge step toward making that vision a reality. It was like throwing open the windows of a stuffy room, letting in fresh air and light, as our source says. What was so revolutionary about going back to the original Greek text?
What's important to remember here is that Erasmus went straight to the source. He bypassed centuries of interpretations and translations, many of which might have distorted the original meaning. This allowed for fresh perspectives, for more accurate theological understanding. It challenged the authority of the Vulgate, which was the standard Latin Bible at the time. It was a scholarly achievement that had huge consequences for religion and for intellectual thought. It paved the way for new understandings of Christian scripture.
It was like saying, hey, let's go back to the basics. Let's see what this really says. But, all of his work advocating for reform, it put him in a really tricky spot as the Reformation gained momentum. Our source describes him as being caught on a narrow bridge between raging torrents. His criticisms had helped to spark the movement, but he was also really disturbed by all the violence and division that came with it. How hard do you think it was for him to navigate that middle ground?
I think this shows just how complicated and unpredictable social and intellectual change can be. Erasmus's critiques of the church definitely helped to create the environment that allowed the Reformation to take hold. But as a humanist scholar, he valued unity, reasoned debate, and gradual change. He hated the violence and the conflict that the Reformation brought with it. Being stuck in that middle ground, it must have been incredibly difficult. It shows the dilemma of a reformer who wants change, but not at the cost of peace and unity.
It's a reminder that sometimes even the best intentions can lead to unforeseen consequences. So as we look back at the life of Desiderius Erasmus, a few key themes stand out. His courage, his relentless pursuit of knowledge, and his dedication to reform, even when it meant standing alone, facing opposition from all sides. And for those of you listening, I want to leave you with a few colons inspired by his life. Are you willing to question what you believe, even if it's uncomfortable? Are you ready to stand up for what's right, even if it means going against the crowd? And how can you use your own talents and your knowledge to make the world a better place?
It's a good reminder that history isn't just something that happened in the past. It can teach us so much about ourselves and about the world we live in today. Erasmus's story reminds us that change is hard. It takes sacrifice. It takes perseverance. But it also shows us that one person with the courage of their convictions can truly make a difference.
That's so true. And on that note, I want you to consider this. Erasmus's life is like a reflection of your own potential. Think about how his struggles can help you understand your own challenges, and how his successes can inspire you to work toward your own vision of a better world. Think about how one idea, like his belief in making knowledge accessible to everyone, can echo through history and change the course of humanity. What whisper do you have inside you that you want to share with the world?
What will your legacy be?
That's something to think about.
It is.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the life of Desiderius Erasmus.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, keep thinking, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a better world.